the civil transactions that were taking place. Come time of the 1400s and 1500s, the Renaissance writers started writing about relationships based on love. It was a chaste relationship. There was no sex or procreation, but it was yearning for and going after the whole sort of Romeo and Juliet scenario. And eventually, when you get into the 1800s and such, then the two lines sort of merge together. That romantic chaste love, the notion of marriage for love instead of marriage for property, really started to take over. And in the 1800s, you started to see marriage for children take over. That when you started to have these independent farms, you think of our push westward here in this country, you needed farm hands. You needed people to work the farm. You needed the cheap labor. Right. So large families became really important. Having a woman who could bear children became important because you were looking to put workers to work on your property to produce. And the fact that we only take a look at the traditional view of marriage, quote unquote, as this church-sanctioned view doesn't really take marriage back to its roots. Right. Marriage was historically about property rights, about establishing parenthood over children, and therefore lineage, so that you could pass on heritage, so that you could pass on what you owned. And it was only in the last several hundred years that any kind of emotional context really got applied to it. And the fact that marriage has changed in definition over the course of our written history, should itself be seen as not set in stone. The definition of marriage has not been set in stone. And to say that the traditional definition is the church-sanctioned definition falls short of the mark. It doesn't go back far enough. It doesn't take into consideration the actual roots. Sure. Now, having said that, I fully support a religion's right to define for the members of that religion whether or not they've undergone the sacrament of marriage, whether or not they're in a holy matrimony. But the civil contract of marriage is not something I think religious institutions should get involved in. When you have two people that want to enter into a contract that has certain rights and responsibilities that it confers on both parties, is not a matter for church, just as a holy matrimony, a religious ceremony, is not a matter for state. Sure.
And that's very interesting, and thank you for the history. That's very interesting. I'm just going to interrupt for one second.
It was the short version.
but it's interesting that we talk about the tradition of marriage. The tradition of marriage has changed, isn't it?
And it changes based on culture, too. When you've got hand fasting ceremonies, and there are cultures throughout the world that have historically allowed same-sex marriage. But this Western tradition that our country's heavily based on, this sort of Greco-Roman, and by the way, if anybody knows anything about Greco-Roman history, having a wife for your legal partner and then having a mistress and a pool boy that you have sex with was the norm in that culture. Yeah. As far as bisexuality goes, in the last 4 minutes, bisexuality is definitely a distinct thing, and there's this phrase, bisexual erasure, which broadly describes the means by which people that are straight and people that are completely gay don't believe bisexuality can really exist. It's bisexuality or pansexuality or multisexuality, whatever the phrase that we want to use, the Kinsey scale defines 0 to 6. And you've got 0 and 1 that are on one end of the spectrum, and 5 and 6 on the other for homosexual and heterosexual. And in the middle, you have 2, 3, and 4. Well, 2, 3, and 4 don't get dropped. They don't fall through the cracks. They're a legitimate part of our society. Right. People can be bisexual and favor one over the other, but people can be bisexual and blind to somebody's gender. It doesn't really matter to some people what their gender is. They fall in love with people's personality, with their traits. Especially for someone whose gender identity might be more fluid, they can shift back and forth as to whether they want to take a masculine role or a feminine role, depending on the relationship they're in. Bisexuality is real.
Yes. Well, as a bisexual woman, you know that. I myself am also a bisexual woman. And yes, it is very real, and it's very apparent that a lot of people just don't get that.
Yes,
we've seen a lot of that, and it's even within our own communities, within the LGBT community. It's sort of unfortunate, but our friend Ron Suresh is very fond of talking about bisexual erasure, and yeah, it's really kind of strange, but it is a real thing.
Yeah, and it's understandable that people who aren't bi can't understand how you can't pick a side, or might be afraid that you have to have both a man and a woman.
Right, exactly.
But I mean, this is all just, it's ignorant, and it's based on fear and misunderstanding.
Sure.
You know, bisexuality just means, or any of the variants of it, just means that you're interested in both men and women.
Yeah. Why should you have to pick a side?
Well, at some of our panels, I like telling people that, you know, I don't believe in limiting my options.
That's right.
But yeah, it's not about having multiple partners. That's something else entirely. It's polyamorism. Bisexuality is simply making yourself open and available to a loving relationship, no matter who it comes from.
Yeah. Which is very cool, isn't it? And
with like a minute left, I'm going to stop, or I'm going to keep going. So you have a minute left.
I do. Well, thank you. You know what? There's some stuff I wanted to talk about, but I'm just simply not going to have time.
I told you should have gone earlier.
No. This is actually not it. This is something that I just happened to have on there, which I didn't even know what it was, because I'm blind as a bat and I couldn't see it.
Oh.
But there was some. Oh, thank you. There was some sort of subject I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to save it for another night, and just because I'll start ranting. But,
and we have less than a minute now.
But we are just about out of time, and so I'm not going to do that. But anyway, that was a really wonderful, and the whole marriage thing is very interesting, and it's just sort of it's funny that if you know, we're so fond of saying that, you know, this is how it is, and this is how it was, and so this is how it should stay. Well, not myself personally, but I embrace change very well. But it's like, guess what? It's done nothing but change throughout history, and it needs to continue to change, and we need to do what's right and what's fair as well. But anyway, I'm not going to go off on that. We have to go, and so we will see you all next week. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful summer, and we'll see you next week. We'll actually have a guest next week.
We'll have a guest next week.
But thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.